That ending is way more important than it looks, because Resident Evil Requiem is not really ending with a monster fight, it is ending with a choice about what kind of world should come after all this pain. A lot of people finish the game and only focus on the shock stuff. Did Leon die or not? Did Emily really survive? What was Elpis? Why is there a photo of Grace and Emily at the end? Why does the game feel sad, even in the hopeful route? But once you put all the pieces together, the ending gets a lot clearer, and also a lot better, because this is not just another Resident Evil ending, where someone blows up a lab and escapes in the last second. This one is about fear, guilt, hope, and whether the series can finally break its own cycle. The whole final part only works if you understand one thing. The game wants you to think Elpis is another terrible thing that should never exist. That is what almost every character around Grace believes. That is what the villains believe. That is what makes the last choice so smart. By the time Grace stands in front of that terminal, everyone has seen too much death, too much mutation, too much cruelty, too much human greed. So the safe answer feels obvious. Destroy it. End it. Burn the whole thing down. Never let one more person touch it again. And that is why the bad ending hits so hard. Because it is the answer most people would choose if they were standing there scared out of their mind. It feels moral. It feels clean. It feels final. But it is the wrong answer. Requiem spends a lot of time building Grace into the exact kind of character who would choose that wrong answer. She is not Leon. She is not someone who has been running through burning cities for years with a gun in one hand and a one-liner in the other. She is scared. She is shaken, and she is carrying pain that goes way deeper than the mission. This whole case is tied to her mother, to old secrets, to things buried under her life that she did not fully understand when the story started. So when she reaches the end, this is not just a puzzle to her. This is personal. It is the worst day of her life crashing into the oldest wound in her life. That is why the ending choice is not just gameplay. It is Grace deciding what she believes about the world after seeing what the world really is. And right in the center of all that is Emily. Emily is not just there to make the story sad. She is the heart of the ending. If you miss that, the whole last scene can feel random, like the game is pulling a twist just to shock you. But Emily matters, because she turns the story from a simple mystery into a question about whether anything broken can actually be saved. Not escaped, not hidden, not delayed, saved. Grace does not just want to solve a case. She wants to protect someone. That changes everything. Once Emily enters the story, Grace stops being a person only looking backward at her mother and starts becoming a person looking forward at someone who still has a future. That is why the ending lands where it lands. A lot of players get stuck on the moment Emily changes and think that is the final truth about her. They think the game is saying she was doomed. Leon did what he had to do, and that is the end of that. And in the dark route, that feeling stays true. Emily becomes one more Resident Evil tragedy. One more innocent life, swallowed by things older, richer, and more evil than any child should ever face. That is the version of the story where the world stays the same. Adults build monsters, children pay for it, and the survivors walk away carrying new scars. Resident Evil has lived in that mood for a long time. Requiem knows that. It uses that expectation against you. So when the final choice appears, it is not really asking whether Grace should press one button or another. It is asking whether this story will repeat the same answer the series has given 100 times. Blow it up, hide it, survive, move on. Or whether this time somebody will finally ask a different question. What if the thing everyone feared was not a weapon at all? What if the last secret left behind in that buried place was not another curse, but the only real cure anybody has ever had? That is where Elpis changes the whole meaning of the ending. If Grace chooses to destroy Elpis, the game gives you a short, brutal answer. Fear wins. The place starts coming apart. Leon tries to hold things together, but everything is already too far gone. Zeno overpowers him. Leon dies. Grace survives, but it is not a real victory. It is survival with a hole in the middle. She leaves, but nothing is healed. The knowledge is gone. The chance is gone. Emily stays lost. The wound stays open. It is not just sad because Leon dies, it is sad because the world learns nothing. Everybody suffers, and the cycle keeps rolling. That is why that ending feels empty on purpose. It is not trying to trick you into thinking you got some cool dark finale. It is showing you what happens when trauma makes the choice. Grace sees horror and answers horror with deletion. It makes emotional sense. It even feels noble for a second. But the result is the same old Resident Evil result. Another facility destroyed, another truth buried, another hero dead, another survivor left to process grief alone. That is not peace, that is just damage control. And the game quietly tells you it is not the real ending. Even without anyone saying it out loud, you can feel it. It cuts off too early. It gives no deep release. It leaves too much hanging. The story is almost telling you that this is what happens when a person acts before understanding what the story was trying to say. Grace ends the danger, but she also kills the answer. She shuts the door before looking inside the room. That is why the bad ending feels more like a refusal than a conclusion. A refusal to trust. A refusal to believe something good could still exist under so much evil. The good ending, the true ending, works because Grace does the harder thing. She does not act from pure fear. She understands. Or at least she understands enough to take the risk. She releases Elpis. And that is the twist that changes everything. Elpis is not what the villains think it is. It is not the ultimate bioweapon. It is not the final crown jewel of evil science. It is the opposite. It is an antiviral. It can undo what all these monsters, labs, and infected bloodlines have done. That one reveal completely flips the final act. Suddenly, the story is no longer about choosing which evil to allow. It is about whether humanity can accept a cure when it has spent so long learning to worship power. Zeno is the perfect person for this twist because he represents the old Resident Evil brain rot in human form. He sees something powerful and instantly thinks, weapon, control, advantage, superiority. He never even considers that the thing he wants could exist to heal instead of dominate. So when he takes Elpis and uses it like a prize, he destroys himself with his own mindset. That is one of the smartest parts of the ending. Zeno does not lose because Grace outguns him or because Leon gives a better speech. He loses because he cannot imagine hope. He literally cannot read the truth in front of him because his whole view of the world is broken. That makes the choice feel bigger than a normal good ending button. Grace is not just releasing medicine. She is rejecting the logic that created all this horror. Every bad actor in this story looks at knowledge and asks, how do I use this to rule, to sell, to live longer, to become stronger, to force the world to kneel? Grace looks at the same thing and asks, who can still be saved? That is why she is the right person to stand at the terminal. Not because she is the strongest, not because she is the smartest in a big movie way. Because she still has enough humanity left to make the right call when every other person in that place would have turned the answer into another nightmare. Then the ending keeps going, and this is another reason why the true route feels complete while the bad route feels cut short. Releasing Elpis does not solve everything in one clean scene. It opens the truth, and then the last chaos happens. Zeno falls from the very power he thought would raise him. Leon gets the chance to keep fighting. The bigger threat shifts. Gideon comes back into the picture, and the story shows that even when the cure is real, human obsession does not vanish just because reality changes. Somebody will always try to twist a good thing into a new path to control. That is why the final battles still have to happen. Elpis does not erase evil. It just takes away the lie that evil had all the answers. This is also where Leon's role in the ending becomes really important. A lot of people talk about Grace because it is her story, and that is true. But Leon is carrying the emotional weight of the old series in his back pocket the whole time. He is what happens when a man survives too much. He is skill, regret, muscle memory, and pain all stacked into one person. So putting him in a story about an antiviral hidden beneath the ruins of everything he has lived through is not random at all. Requiem is taking one of the faces most tied to Resident Evil's long history of infection and horror and placing him next to the first real sign that the world may finally have another path. That is why his fate changes so much depending on Grace's choice. In the dark ending, Leon dies because the past wins. The old logic wins. The world eats another hero and calls it survival. In the true ending, Leon lives because Grace chooses a future instead of a clean destruction. That is not just a plot branch. That is the message. If you choose fear, the series keeps doing what it always did. If you choose hope, even someone like Leon, who has carried the weight of too many dead people for too long, can still walk out. And then we get to the part everybody wants to know about. Emily. Yes, in the true ending, Emily survives. Not in a vague, maybe, fan theory, blink and you miss it way. The game shows that she is recovered alive after what happened at Rhodes Hill. You see that her body is still there, still enclosed in that horrible cocoon-like state. And then the story makes it clear that things are not over for her. Later, the ending shows the result. Emily is alive, cured, and part of Grace's life. That is one of the biggest reasons the true ending is the canon one. It is the only route that pays off the emotional promise the story made the second Grace decided Emily mattered. This is why the "Did Emily survive?" question matters so much more than a simple yes or no. If she had stayed dead no matter what, Requiem would become a very different story. It would be saying that Grace's care was meaningful, but still powerless. It would be saying the system can hurt a child so badly that even at the end, the best anybody can do is mourn better. But that is not what the true ending chooses. The true ending says, the damage was real, the suffering was real, the trauma was real. But not every stolen future stays stolen forever. That is a huge change in tone for Resident Evil, without becoming soft or fake. And it works because the game earns it through the Elpis twist. Emily is not saved because the writers wanted a cheap, happy ending. She is saved because the whole point of Elpis is that the story spent hours teaching you to fear the wrong thing. Once Elpis is understood for what it really is, Emily's survival stops feeling like a miracle that came from nowhere and starts feeling like the exact emotional answer the story was building toward. The child used as a test subject. The child dragged into horror she did not choose. The child Grace could not let go of. She becomes the proof that this choice mattered. That is also why the ending does not just stop at Emily is alive. It gives you the desk scene. That little scene says more than some games say in 10 cutscenes. Grace is back at work. Life has moved forward. The nightmare did not erase her. And on her desk are 2 photos. One with her mother, one with Emily. That image is not there just to be sweet. It is the whole ending in one shot. The photo with her mother keeps the past alive. Grace has not forgotten where all this began for her. She has not thrown Alyssa away emotionally just because she now understands more. The pain is still part of her. The love is still part of her. The search that started this story still matters. But next to that photo is Emily, and that changes the meaning. Grace is no longer living only in memory. She is now responsible for someone else's future. That is the real reason the ending hits so hard for so many people. The story begins with Grace pulled back into death, secrets, old crimes, and buried family truth. It ends with Grace becoming a protector. The direction of her life changes. She does not stay only as the daughter looking back. She becomes the adult looking forward. That is growth in the most human way possible. No speech, no big victory line, just a desk, 2 photos, and the quiet message that trauma did not get the final word. And the Emily photo has another layer that makes it even better. The story turns into a circle. Grace was shaped by the care she received. By the end, she gives that care to Emily. That is why so many people say the ending comes full circle, and they are right. This is not just about adoption in the legal sense, or about who takes care of who after the credits. It is about what gets passed down. Pain can be passed down. Secrets can be passed down. Experiments, power games, and corruption can be passed down. But care can also be passed down. Protection can be passed down. The ending chooses that path. So when people ask what the final photo means, the answer is not only Grace adopted Emily, even though that is part of it. The photo means Grace refused to let Emily become just another case file or another tragic memory. She made Emily part of her life. She took the person who represented the story's deepest wound and turned that into a bond. That is the game showing you that survival alone is not enough. Real victory is what you do after surviving. Real victory is whether you build something human out of what tried to destroy you. And there is something else very smart about that scene. It does not scream its message. It trusts the image. That is why it stays with people. If the game had ended with a long speech about hope and healing, it would have felt forced. Instead, it just shows you the result. Grace is there. Emily is there. The past is there. The future is there. One photo looks backward. One photo looks forward. That is the whole story. Now, if you want to go even deeper, the photo scene also tells you something about Grace herself. Through a lot of Requiem, Grace is dragged by events. She is reacting, surviving, learning, panicking, pushing forward because she has no choice. By the end, for the first time, her life feels chosen. She chose to release Elpis. She chose not to let fear decide. She chose not to leave Emily behind emotionally, even after the physical danger ended. The desk scene is calm, but under that calm is a new kind of strength. Grace is no longer only the person this story happened to. She is now the person shaping what comes next. That is also why the ending is comforting, even though it never becomes cheerful in a silly way. A lot of horror stories make the mistake of thinking hope means turning off the darkness. Requiem does not do that. It remembers every awful thing that happened. The endings work because the game never pretends Emily was never hurt, never pretends Grace is suddenly fine, never pretends Leon and the others can just laugh off what happened. The comfort comes from something more real. After all that suffering, somebody finally chooses not to answer pain with more erasure. Somebody keeps the truth alive and uses it to save a life. That makes the true ending feel earned. It also explains why the bad ending is not just the evil one. The bad ending is the understandable one. It is the ending of somebody who cannot bear one more risk. Somebody who sees one more secret lab and says, enough. So if you chose that route first, the game is not calling you stupid. It is showing you how easy it is to do the wrong thing when the wrong thing looks like protection. Destroying Elpis sounds moral because the Resident Evil world has trained you to think every hidden project is poison. Requiem's big move is revealing that this time the poison is actually the fear that keeps humanity from accepting a cure. That is why the word tied to Elpis matters so much. Hope is not being used in a cheesy way here. Hope is hard in this story. Hope means choosing the thing that could still save people when every lesson the world taught you says to crush it before it can hurt you. Hope means Grace looking at a history built on lies and still believing not every secret ends in ruin. Hope means Leon, a man built out of old disasters, still living to see one answer that is not just a bigger gun or a bigger explosion. Hope means Emily getting a future after the story seemed to take that away from her. And if you think about it, Emily surviving is the strongest proof that Grace made the right choice, because Emily is the exact person fear would have written off. Too damaged, too infected, too late. That is how these stories usually go. The monster form becomes the last word, but Requiem says no. The last word can be the person underneath, the child underneath, the life underneath. That is why Emily's survival is not just a nice detail, it is the theme made real. This is also where Requiem becomes more than a simple ending explained kind of game. It starts talking to the whole series. For years, Resident Evil has been built on escalation, more outbreaks, more experiments, more powerful virus strains, more organizations fighting over worse and worse things. By making Elpis an antiviral instead of a superweapon, Requiem is not just ending its own story, it is challenging the whole shape of the franchise. It is asking, what happens if the world does not just keep spinning deeper into mutation forever? What happens if there is finally something that pushes back in the other direction? That does not mean the series becomes soft or has no monsters now. The post-credits make sure of that. Even after the hopeful ending, danger is still moving in the dark. The ruins are not left alone. Other people still want things from Ark. Other forces are still operating. So the game is not pretending evil has vanished. That would be way too easy. What it is saying is that the balance has changed. The old order, where every hidden discovery automatically belonged to the people who wanted power, has been broken. Now there is an answer out there that threatens the whole logic of the bioweapon world. That is a huge deal. And that is why the final stinger matters. A lot of people focus so much on Grace, Emily, and Leon that they almost forget the little sting left at the end. But that last scene is there to remind you, this is Resident Evil. One good answer does not erase the men with masks, guns, orders, and hidden goals. Somebody still moves into the wreckage. Somebody still retrieves something. Somebody still thinks the story is not over. So even the hopeful ending refuses to become too clean. The game lets Grace and Emily have human closure, but it also tells you the larger machine of the world is still turning. That is actually one more reason the desk photo matters. The big political and military nightmare is not over. Bigger plots still exist. Mystery groups still exist. Hidden operations still exist. So the desk scene becomes even more precious because it is small, personal, human. Requiem knows giant franchise lore can swallow emotion if you let it. So it ends the emotional arc in a room, with a desk, with 2 photos, with a phone call, with a quiet life that almost did not happen. Then it reminds you that the bigger storm is still out there. That balance is why the ending works so well. Now let's talk about Leon again, because his place in Emily's story is easy to miss if you only look at plot points. Leon is part of why Emily's survival feels so powerful. For a while, it looks like Emily's fate becomes one more thing he could not stop. One more child, one more victim, one more nightmare he has to carry. That is a very Leon kind of wound. Resident Evil has put that man through enough failure, guilt, and impossible choices to fill 10 games. So letting the true ending reveal that Emily can still be saved changes his part in the story too. It does not erase what happened, but it prevents that moment from hardening into one more final regret. That matters, especially in a game so tied to old ghosts. This is also why the bad ending is so cruel. Leon's death there is not just shock value. It is the world snapping back into the ugliest version of itself. The veteran who came all this way, who tried to protect Grace, who carries all this history, dies right at the edge of an answer that could have changed everything. That is not random cruelty. It is the story showing you what happens when the truth is destroyed too early. Leon dies not only because Xeno is dangerous. He dies because the possibility of another future is thrown away. In a weird way, Grace's choice becomes Leon's fate. And because Requiem is clever, that also means Grace has to live with whichever world she chooses. In the bad ending, she survives, but survival is almost a punishment. She walks away knowing the cost. In the true ending, she still carries pain, but now she also carries responsibility. She has Emily, she has the truth, she has proof that saving someone was possible. That is a much heavier, but much better, burden. Grace does not get a fairy tale. She gets a future. The Emily scene in the ending is also important because it changes how you read the whole story before it. Once you know Emily survives in the canon route, earlier scenes take on a different feeling. Emily stops being only a tragic symbol and becomes the measure of Grace's moral choices. The more Grace refuses to give up on Emily, the more the story shows you who Grace really is. By the time the desk photo appears, it does not feel like some random afterthought. It feels like the natural final answer to a promise the game kept making under the surface. Grace did not just meet Emily. Grace became tied to her. And for a series like Resident Evil, that is actually a pretty bold move. The games are often full of intense partnerships, tragic losses, and mentor-type bonds. But this kind of quiet guardian ending hits different. It is not flashy. There is no huge crowd cheering. Nobody calls Grace a hero in some big public scene. The reward is not fame. It is a child being alive and cared for. That is why the desk photo feels so human. It brings the ending down from world-changing virus lore to one simple truth. After all this, one person came home and made sure another person did too. That is why I think the ending works even for people who usually hate neat endings, because this is not neat. Emily surviving does not make Rhodes Hill less horrifying. It does not excuse Gideon, Zeno, Spencer, or anybody else who built the cage around her life. It does not undo the terror Grace went through. It does not wipe away the dead. What it does is deny those people total victory. They do not get to define Emily only by what they turned her into. Grace gets the final say, and her answer is that Emily is still a person, still worth saving, still worth loving after all of it. And honestly, that is what makes the title feel right. Requiem sounds like death. It sounds like mourning. It sounds like the end of something already lost. But the true ending plays with that idea in a smart way. The Requiem is not only for the people who died, it is also for the old world that kept feeding on infection, secrecy, and power. The game buries that logic, or at least starts to. In its place, it leaves a much quieter thing. Grace at a desk, Emily in a photo, life continuing. Horror did not vanish, but it did not get the last word. There is one more thing about the ending photo that I really like. It tells you Grace did not run from what happened. A lot of characters in horror survive, and then seem like they just vanished into some blank future. Requiem does not do that. Grace goes back to work. She is still part of the world. She is still connected to real life. That matters because it shows the ending is not retreat. It is integration. She is not hiding in a cabin pretending the nightmare never happened. She is carrying it, but she is still living. Emily being in that life too means the bond is not temporary. It is not a hospital visit kind of ending. It is a lasting change. That is why the photo is so loaded. A photo is memory made solid. It sits there. It stays. By putting Emily in that frame, the game is saying Emily is not an accident in Grace's story. She is part of Grace's story now. She belongs in the part of life that continues after the credits. That is what makes the scene feel so warm and so sad at the same time. Warm because Emily lived. Sad because the road to that photo was awful. The game wants you to hold both feelings at once. And then there is the simple answer to the question some people still ask. Where is Emily at the end? She is not missing in some vague sense. She is not trapped forever in that creature form. She is not just a memory in Grace's head. In the true ending, Emily is rescued, cured, and later living as part of Grace's life. The game is very clearly pushing that as the emotional payoff. So if someone tells you the ending leaves Emily's fate fully open, that is not really what the story is doing. The story wants you to leave with relief about Emily, even while it keeps the larger world unsettled. That same clarity applies to the photo scene. The ending is not just saying Grace feels bad for Emily or wants to remember her. It is saying Grace took her in. Grace became her guardian. That image is there because the story wants to show a bond, a home, and a future. It is one of the most direct but quiet things Resident Evil has ever done in an ending, and I think that is why it stuck with so many players. It says something huge without needing to yell. The best way to understand all of Requiem's endings is this. The bad ending is about stopping the nightmare. The true ending is about stopping the nightmare and saving what the nightmare tried to steal. That is a much stronger ending. Anybody can blow up a lab. The hard part is leaving with a person, a truth, and a reason to believe the world can become something better. Grace does that. That is why she earns the final scene. And the more I think about it, the more I feel the true ending is not really optimistic in a childish way. It is optimistic in a brave way. It knows terrible things happen. It knows people lie, experiment, kill, and hide the truth. It knows institutions fail. It knows children suffer because adults want power. It knows survivors carry damage with them long after the danger is gone. But it still says, one life saved matters. One future restored matters. One human bond matters. That is not soft. That is strong. So when you step back and look at the whole ending, this is what it is really saying. Destroying Elpis feels safe, but it only repeats the old world. Releasing Elpis feels dangerous, but it opens the door to healing. Leon's fate shows the difference between those two worlds. Emily's survival proves the hopeful choice was real. The photo on Grace's desk shows the emotional cost turned into emotional meaning.
Where's that report?
And the final stinger in the ruins reminds you that hope does not mean the fight is over. It only means the fight finally has another weapon besides fear. That is why Resident Evil Requiem's ending feels different from a lot of endings in this series. It still has the monster chaos, the twisted science, the collapsing facility, the mystery men in the shadows, all of that. But under all that, it is telling a very simple human story. A woman learns the truth about where her pain began. A child who should have been lost gets another chance. A man who has seen too much death lives to see a different answer. And instead of ending on pure destruction, the game ends on care. That is the point of Emily. That is the point of Elpis. That is the point of the photo. And that is why the canon ending is not just the happier one. It is the one that actually finishes the story. Watch the next video.